In the pre-dawn hours of May 24, 1819, as morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Kensington Palace like whispered secrets, a baby's cry pierced the silence of rooms that had sheltered royal children for generations. The sound was small and fragile, yet it carried within it the seeds of an empire's destiny. This was the moment when Alexandrina Victoria entered the world, a tiny princess whom no one expected would ever wear the crown, born into circumstances so humble that even the palace servants wondered what future could possibly await such an unlikely heir. The rooms where she took her first breath were modest by royal standards, reflecting the reduced circumstances of her parents. Her father, the Duke of Kent, fourth son of King George III, had lived most of his life in the shadow of older brothers who seemed destined for greatness. Her mother, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was a German princess whose first marriage had ended in tragedy, leaving her with two young children and an uncertain future in a foreign land. The marriage that had brought Victoria into existence was itself born of duty rather than romance. The Duke of Kent, approaching 50, had abandoned his comfortable bachelor life with his longtime companion to fulfill his obligation to produce an heir for the throne. The royal succession hung by the slenderest of threads. King George III's many sons had produced few legitimate children, and the nation anxiously watched as the old king's mind wandered in the twilight of madness while his sons aged without, securing the dynasty. As the infant Victoria slept in her simple cot, wrapped in linen that was fine but not luxurious, the palace around her whispered with the gossip and intrigue that surrounded her birth. Would she live through the dangerous early months when so many children of the era perished? Would her father's debts force the family into exile? Would the succession pass through other lines, leaving her as merely another forgotten princess in the vast tapestry of royal genealogy? The baptism ceremony, held in the cupola room at Kensington Palace on a June afternoon when sunlight streamed through tall windows, revealed the complexity of Victoria's position in the royal hierarchy. Her godfathers included the Prince Regent and Tsar Alexander III of Russia, but the gathering was smaller and less grand than those for princes closer to the throne. The name chosen for her, Alexandrina Victoria, honored her powerful Russian godfather while preserving her mother's name, but she would be known simply as Victoria, a name that seemed somehow too large for such a small and uncertain beginning. The Duke of Kent's sudden death from pneumonia in January 1820, when Victoria was merely 8 months old, transformed her world in ways she was too young to understand. The man who had sacrificed his personal happiness to father an heir would never see his daughter grow beyond infancy, never know that his sacrifice would prove to be the foundation of the greatest reign in British history. The baby who had been crying in his arms during his final illness became, overnight, a fatherless child dependent entirely on her mother's protection and the whims of uncles who controlled the succession. Victoria's early years unfolded in the peculiar isolation of royal childhood, but one made more intense by their reduced circumstances and uncertain status. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, created around her daughter a protective cocoon that was part loving care and part strategic necessity. The Kensington system, as it came to be known, governed every aspect of Victoria's upbringing with rules that ensured she was never alone with anyone outside the approved circle, never allowed to make independent decisions, never permitted to forget that her every action might someday be scrutinized by history. The schoolroom where young Victoria spent her mornings was filled with sunlight and serious purpose. Her governess, Baroness Letzen, brought to the task of royal education a German precision combined with genuine affection for her precocious charge. The lessons encompassed languages and literature, history and geography, music and drawing, all delivered with the understanding that this child might someday need to govern the most powerful empire the world had ever known, though such a possibility still seemed remote and unlikely. In the afternoons, when lessons were complete, Victoria would walk in the palace gardens with her half-sister Feodora, whose presence provided both companionship and a reminder of the complicated family dynamics that surrounded royal life. These gardens, with their ancient trees and carefully tended paths, became Victoria's world in miniature, beautiful but bounded, safe but somehow incomplete. The sounds of London beyond the palace walls remained distant and mysterious, a reminder of the vast realm that lay beyond her sheltered existence. Her dolls, over 130 of them meticulously dressed and named, became Victoria's subjects in childhood, games that unknowingly prepared her for the responsibilities of queenship. Each doll had its own character and backstory, creating a miniature court where the young princess learned to navigate the complex relationships of power and protocol. In her careful arrangement of these toy courtiers, perhaps some divine providence was already preparing her for the day when she would manage the personalities and politics of real ministers and foreign dignitaries. The revelation of her place in the succession came dramatically on a March day in 1830 when Victoria, then 11, discovered a genealogical chart hidden in her history book. The realization that she stood third in line to the throne, with only her uncles, the Duke of Clarence and Duke of Cumberland, ahead of her, struck the child with a force that brought tears to her eyes. "I will be good," she declared to her governess, words that revealed both the weight of destiny settling on young shoulders and the innate sense of duty that would characterize her entire reign. The death of King George IV in June 1830 brought her uncle William IV to the throne and moved Victoria one step closer to a crown she had never truly expected to inherit. The old king's death also marked the end of an era of royal excess and eccentricity, replaced by the more modest court of a man who had spent his youth in the navy and understood the value of duty over display. For Victoria, watching these changes, from her protected position at Kensington, the lesson was clear. The crown could come to anyone, and those who wore it must be prepared to serve something greater than themselves. As Victoria entered her teenage years, her education intensified, under the growing realization that she might indeed become queen. The morning hours in the schoolroom expanded to include more serious study of constitutional law and the principles of governance. Her German tutors were supplemented by English scholars who understood the unique requirements of a sovereign who would rule through divine right, but through the consent of an increasingly democratic parliament. The young princess's character began to emerge during these formative years, strong-willed but dutiful, emotional but disciplined, fiercely loyal to those she loved, but capable of surprising hardness toward those who disappointed her. The isolation of her upbringing had created in Victoria a hunger for genuine human connection, combined with an almost painful awareness of the distance that royal status created between herself and others. Her relationship with her mother grew increasingly complex as Victoria matured. The Duchess of Kent's protective instincts, so essential during Victoria's vulnerable childhood, began to feel restrictive to a young woman developing her own opinions and desires. The system that had preserved Victoria's safety and prepared her for the throne also created tensions that would shape their relationship for years to come, as daughter and mother struggled to redefine their roles in the face of approaching destiny. As 1837 dawned, with King William V's health failing and no children of his own to inherit the throne, the reality of Victoria's future became undeniable. The 18-year-old princess who had once seemed an unlikely heir now stood on the threshold. of becoming the most powerful monarch in the world. The child born into shadows and raised in isolation was about to step into the brightest spotlight in human history, carrying with her the lessons of a protected childhood and the dreams of a nation ready for renewal and growth. In the quiet evening, hours at Kensington Palace, as Victoria prepared for sleep in rooms that would soon become merely a memory of her simpler past, the weight of approaching responsibility settled around her like a royal mantle. The girl who had learned duty before she learned to spell her name would soon discover that the greatest education for sovereignty comes not from books or tutors, but from the daily choices that define a reign and shape the destiny of millions, who will never know the monarch's private struggles or personal sacrifices. The clock in the corner of Victoria's bedroom at Kensington Palace ticked steadily toward dawn on June 20th, 1837, marking not just the passage of another night, but the final hours of a young woman's private life. At 18, Princess Victoria slept the deep sleep of youth, unaware that royal messengers were already crossing London's cobblestone streets through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying news that would transform her from a sheltered princess into the sovereign of the mightiest empire the world had ever known. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace at 5 o'clock in the morning, their solemn faces and formal dress announcing the gravity of their mission even before they spoke. The servants who admitted them moved with hushed reverence, understanding that they were witnessing history in the making. King William IV had died at Windsor Castle 2 hours earlier, and his 18-year-old niece was now, by God's grace and Parliament's law, Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The scene that followed would be remembered by all who witnessed it as a perfect crystallization of the dignity and determination that would characterize Victoria's entire reign. Awakened from sleep and hastily dressed in a simple white dress and slippers, the new queen descended to the drawing room where the great officers of state waited to pay homage to their sovereign. Her youth was evident in her slight figure and unadorned appearance, but her bearing carried an authority that seemed to come from some deep well of royal instinct. When the Archbishop knelt before her and addressed her as "Your Majesty," for the first time, Victoria felt the full weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. The words echoed in the morning stillness like a prayer or a prophecy, transforming forever the relationship between this young woman and the world she had inherited. The girl who had played with dolls in these very rooms now held the lives and fortunes of millions in her small but steady hands. Her first official act as queen demonstrated the strength of character that had been developing through years of careful education and observation. While her mother and the ambitious Sir John Conroy expected to maintain their controlling influence over the new sovereign, Victoria quietly but firmly established her independence. She requested an hour alone with the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, making clear that she would not be governed by the same rules that had constrained her as a princess. The relationship that blossomed between the 18-year-old Queen and her 58-year-old Prime Minister became one of the most important influences in shaping Victoria's early reign. Lord Melbourne, a cultured Whig aristocrat with a worldly charm and paternal manner, provided the political education that no tutor could have supplied. Their daily meetings, often extending for hours, covered everything from constitutional theory to the practical realities of governing a nation undergoing rapid social and economic transformation. Victoria's first Privy Council meeting, held on the day of her accession, astonished the elderly ministers and officials who had expected to find a nervous girl overwhelmed by her sudden elevation. Instead, they encountered a composed young woman who listened carefully to their advice but made her own decisions with quiet confidence. The Archbishop of Canterbury later wrote that he had never seen someone so young display such natural dignity in circumstances that would have challenged the most experienced ruler. The move from Kensington Palace to Buckingham Palace in July 1837 symbolized Victoria's transition from protected princess to reigning monarch. The palace, recently renovated by her uncle George IV, provided a grander stage for royal ceremony, but also represented the isolation that came with supreme power. In her private apartments, surrounded by luxury that still felt foreign to someone raised in relative simplicity, Victoria began to understand the loneliness that accompanies absolute authority. Her coronation on June 28, 1838 in Westminster Abbey became a celebration not just of a new monarch, but of a nation's renewed faith in its institutions. The ceremony, planned with careful attention to both tradition and popular appeal, drew hundreds of thousands of spectators to London's streets. The sight of their young queen, small and serious in her heavy robes, and St. Edward's crown, inspired a devotion that would sustain her through the trials and triumphs of the decades ahead. The early months of Victoria's reign unfolded against the backdrop of a nation experiencing unprecedented change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the landscape and social structure of Britain, creating new forms of wealth and new kinds of poverty. The railways were beginning to shrink distances that had seemed insurmountable to previous generations, while the growing cities struggled to accommodate the workers who flocked to the factories and mills that drove the empire's expanding economy. Victoria's education in the realities of governing began immediately, as she grappled with issues that her sheltered upbringing had never prepared her to understand. The Chartist movement's demands for democratic reform, the ongoing crisis in Ireland, the complex relationships with European powers still adjusting to the changes brought by the Napoleonic Wars, all required decisions that would affect millions of lives and shape the empire's future direction. Her personal relationships during this period reflected the tension between her human need for affection and the formal constraints of royal protocol. The friendship with Lord Melbourne provided intellectual companionship and political guidance, but it also exposed the Queen to criticism from those who thought their relationship too close and too partisan. The visits from her German cousins, particularly Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, offered glimpses of a different kind of life, one where personal happiness might coexist with royal duty. The Queen's daily routine during these early years established patterns that would endure throughout her reign. Morning audiences with ministers and officials, afternoon rides in Hyde Park where she could see and be seen by her subjects, evening hours devoted to correspondence and the reading that Lord Melbourne encouraged as essential to understanding her realm. The red boxes filled with government documents became constant companions, symbols of the endless stream of decisions that awaited royal attention and approval. Victoria's growing understanding of her constitutional role as a monarch who reigned, but did not rule, required constant adjustment and occasional struggle. The tradition of British democracy demanded that she accept the advice of ministers she might personally dislike, support policies she might privately question, and maintain the appearance of political neutrality even when her own opinions were strong and decided. Learning to balance personal convictions with constitutional duty became one of the greatest challenges of her early reign. The social season at court, with its endless round of drawing rooms, levees, and state dinners, provided Victoria with opportunities to observe and understand the aristocratic society that still dominated British political and cultural life. The elaborate etiquette and formal ceremonies that governed royal entertaining served purposes beyond mere display. They created structured environments where the monarch could assess character, reward loyalty, and maintain the mystique that surrounded the crown. Her increasing confidence as a ruler became evident in her handling of political crises that might have overwhelmed a less determined sovereign. The bedchamber crisis of 1839, when she refused to dismiss the Whig ladies of her household, despite pressure from incoming Conservative ministers, demonstrated her growing understanding of how personal relationships intersected with political power. Her insistence on maintaining her independence marked a crucial step in her evolution from protected princess to confident queen. As Victoria's second year on the throne drew to a close, the young woman who had awakened to find herself queen had grown into her role with remarkable grace and determination. The sheltered childhood that had once seemed a disadvantage now appeared as a blessing. Her lack of exposure to court intrigue and political machination had preserved an idealism and sense of duty that more worldly training might have compromised. The question of marriage, which had been distant and theoretical during her protected youth, now became a matter of state importance that could not be postponed indefinitely. The queen, who had learned to govern herself, must now consider sharing her life with someone who could support her burden while understanding the unique constraints that came with loving someone who belonged first to her people and only secondarily to herself. As evening fell over Buckingham Palace and Queen Victoria prepared for sleep in royal apartments that still felt strange despite months of occupation, she could reflect on a transformation that seemed almost impossible to believe. The girl who had discovered her destiny in a history book now shaped that same history with her daily decisions. The princess, who had been kept from independence, now exercised the ultimate independence of sovereignty. The dawn of her crown had revealed not just a queen, but a woman capable of bearing the weight of an empire's hopes and dreams with dignity, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to duty that would define her reign and her era. The autumn afternoon of October 1839 cast long shadows across the marble floors of Windsor Castle. As Queen Victoria, now 20 years old and established in her sovereignty, waited with unusual nervousness for the arrival of her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. 3 years on the throne had taught her to command ministers and manage affairs of state, but the flutter in her heart as his carriage approached reminded her that beneath the crown beat the heart of a young woman who had known little of love's sweet mysteries. The first glimpse of Albert as he stepped from his carriage into the castle courtyard revealed a transformation that took Victoria's breath away. The somewhat awkward boy she remembered from his previous visit had grown into a man of striking handsomeness, tall and elegant, with dark hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of thought and feeling. His bearing combined the dignity of royal breeding with a warmth that immediately drew people to him, and Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure dissolve into something more wonderfully human. Their first evening together, dining ins, the relative intimacy of Windsor's family quarters, unfolded with a magic that Victoria had never experienced before. Albert's conversation revealed interests far beyond the usual pursuits of German princes. He spoke passionately of music and art, of scientific discovery and social reform, of dreams for making the world more beautiful and just. His serious nature complemented Victoria's own sense of duty, while his gentle humour brought lightness to moments that might otherwise have felt heavy with expectation. The morning walks through Windsor's ancient gardens became opportunities for Victoria to see Albert away from the formal constraints of court protocol. Here, among the carefully tended roses and along paths worn smooth by centuries of royal footsteps, she discovered the man behind the prince. Albert's genuine interest in botany and his knowledge of landscape design revealed a mind that found beauty in both grand concepts and careful details. When he suggested improvements to the garden layout, Victoria found herself imagining a future where they might work together to create something lasting and lovely. The decision to propose marriage came to Victoria with a clarity that surprised her own ministers and advisers. Royal marriages were typically matters of lengthy negotiation and diplomatic consideration, but Victoria's certainty about Albert swept away such conventional delays. On October 15th, just 5 days after his arrival, she summoned Albert to a private audience where the roles of suitor and pursued were reversed by the constitutional requirement that the Queen herself must make any proposal of marriage. The proposal, seen in Victoria's private sitting room, carried all the tenderness of any young couple's declaration of love, despite the unique circumstances that surrounded it. Albert's acceptance, warm and immediate, brought tears to Victoria's eyes as she realized that the loneliness that had shadowed her reign might now be shared with someone who understood both her public duties and her private dreams. Their first kiss, exchanged in the golden afternoon light that streamed through palace windows, sealed not just a personal commitment, but a partnership that would reshape the monarchy itself. The public announcement of their engagement created a sensation throughout Britain and across Europe. The press, which had followed Victoria's every move since her accession, now focused with intense interest on the romance that had captured their young queen's heart. Political leaders debated the implications of the match, while ordinary citizens found in their sovereign's love story a fairy tale that seemed to promise happiness for the nation as well as for the royal couple. Albert's introduction to British political life required careful management by both Victoria and her ministers. As a German prince, he faced suspicion from those who worried about foreign influence over their queen. His serious demeanor and intellectual interests, so attractive to Victoria, struck some as overly earnest for the more casual style of British aristocratic society. The Queen found herself in the unfamiliar position of defending her choice while also helping the man she loved adapt to a role that had no clear precedent in British constitutional tradition. The months between engagement and wedding became a period of intense preparation, both practical and emotional. Victoria threw herself into planning a ceremony that would reflect both royal tradition and her personal desires, while Albert prepared for the dramatic changes that marriage to the Queen of England would bring to his life. Their correspondence during brief separations revealed two people learning to balance the formal requirements of their positions with the intimate language of lovers discovering each other. The wedding morning of February 10, 1840 dawned cold and clear over London, with crowds gathering before dawn to witness the procession from Buckingham Palace to the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Victoria, who had insisted on a morning ceremony despite court tradition favouring afternoon weddings, wore white satin trimmed with lace in a fashion that would influence bridal wear for generations to come. Her choice of a relatively modest ceremony, emphasizing personal meaning over state grandeur, reflected her desire to claim this day as her own rather than just another royal obligation. The wedding ceremony itself became a perfect fusion of public, pageantry, and private emotion. Victoria's voice, clear and strong as she spoke her vows, carried to every corner of the chapel and seemed to symbolize her confidence in the choice she had made. Albert's responses, delivered with equal conviction despite the nervousness that showed in his hands, demonstrated his understanding that he was marrying not just a woman, but an institution that would now become part of his own identity. The honeymoon at Windsor Castle offered the newlyweds their first opportunity to discover the rhythms of married life within the unique constraints of Victoria's position. The state business that could not be postponed, even for personal happiness, required careful negotiation of time and attention. Albert's quick grasp of constitutional principles and his thoughtful suggestions about government matters revealed to Victoria that she had found not just a husband, but a trusted advisor whose judgment complemented her own instincts. Their early married life unfolded against the backdrop of a nation watching with fascination and approval. The obvious happiness of their royal couple seemed to reflect a broader confidence in Britain's future. The Industrial Revolution, was transforming the country's economic power, while reforms in government and society promised a more just and prosperous future for all classes. Victoria and Albert's marriage appeared to symbolize this spirit of progress and hope. The establishment of their daily routines at Windsor and Buckingham Palace revealed how successfully they had merged their individual personalities into a working partnership. Victoria's morning audiences with ministers continued, but now Albert often joined these meetings, offering insights that reflected his European background and his growing understanding of British politics. Their afternoon rides together became opportunities for private conversation about the affairs of state that increasingly occupied both their minds. Albert's influence on Victoria's intellectual development became apparent in the broader range of interests she began to pursue. His passion for music led to regular concerts at court, featuring the finest performers of the age. His knowledge of art and design inspired improvements to the royal residences that reflected both aesthetic vision and practical functionality. His interest in science and technology introduced Victoria to the remarkable inventions and discoveries that were reshaping the modern world. The question of Albert's official role in government remained a delicate matter that required careful navigation. While Victoria valued his advice and increasingly relied on his judgment, the Constitution provided no formal position for a royal consort. The solution they developed, Albert as Victoria's private secretary and closest advisor without official title or recognition, worked in practice but sometimes created tensions with ministers who resented his influence or misunderstood his motivations. As their first wedding anniversary approached, Victoria and Albert had established a pattern of life that combined personal happiness with public service in ways that strengthened both. Their love, rather than distracting from their royal duties, had enhanced their capacity to serve by providing emotional support and intellectual companionship that made the burdens of sovereignty more bearable. The young queen who had once carried the weight of the crown alone now shared that burden with someone who understood its demands and supported her determination to meet them with grace and wisdom. The pregnancy that Victoria announced in the early months of 1841 added a new dimension to their marriage and to the monarchy itself. The prospect of an heir who would carry forward their values and their vision for Britain's future filled both parents with joy and determination to create a family life that would prepare their children for the unique responsibilities of royal birth, while also giving them the love and stability that both Victoria and Albert had sometimes lacked in their own childhoods. As spring returned to the palace gardens, where they had first walked together as engaged couple, Victoria and Albert could reflect on a transformation that had exceeded their most optimistic hopes. The political alliance that many had expected their marriage to become had instead become a true partnership of hearts and minds, strengthening both individuals and enhancing their service to the nation they loved and led together. The morning sun filtered through the nursery windows at Windsor Castle on November 23, 1840, as Queen Victoria held her firstborn child, Princess Victoria Adelaide Mary Louisa, against her heart and marvelled at the profound transformation that motherhood had brought to her understanding of love and responsibility. At 21, the young queen who had learned to govern millions now faced the more intimate challenge of raising a daughter who would carry forward the values and traditions of the House of Hanover into an uncertain future. The birth of Princess Vicky, as she came to be known within the family, marked the beginning of Victoria's dual reign over an empire that spanned the globe and over a nursery that would eventually house 9 children, each carrying their own portion of royal destiny and parental hope. The Queen, who had once known loneliness as an only child, now committed herself to creating a family large enough to ensure that none of her children would experience the isolation that had marked her own youth. Prince Albert's involvement in their children's upbringing reflected his modern understanding of fatherhood and education. Unlike previous royal fathers who had left child-rearing entirely to nurses and tutors, Albert took an active role in planning their education and spending time with them daily. His belief that royal children should be prepared for useful lives, whether or not they inherited thrones, influenced every aspect of their training from earliest infancy through young adulthood. The birth of Prince Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, on November 9, 1841, brought both joy and intense pressure to the royal household. As the heir to the throne, Bertie, as he was known to his family, carried expectations that seemed almost impossible for any child to fulfill. His education became a matter of national importance, with leading scholars and educators consulted about the best methods for preparing a future king for the complexities of modern constitutional monarchy. The royal nursery at Windsor became a laboratory for Albert's progressive ideas about child development and education. The children learned languages from native speakers, studied science through hands-on experiments, and received instruction in music and art from masters of their crafts. Physical exercise was emphasized equally with intellectual development, and the children spent hours each day outdoors exploring the castle grounds and learning to appreciate the natural world that Albert considered essential to human development. Victoria's approach to motherhood reflected the tension between her tender feelings for her children and her firm belief in discipline and duty. She loved her children intensely, but expected them to meet high standards of behavior and achievement. Her correspondence with them, filled with both affection and moral instruction, revealed a mother determined to prepare her offspring for lives of service while also ensuring that they understood the privileges and responsibilities of their birth. BT. Arrival of Princess Alice in 1843, Prince Alfred in 1844, Princess Helena in 1846, Princess Louise in 1848, Prince Arthur in 1850, Prince Leopold in 1853, and Princess Beatrice in 1857 created a household that buzzed with the energy and chaos of a large family. Each child developed their own personality and interests under their parents' watchful care, while the family dynamic grew increasingly complex as older children helped care for younger siblings, and everyone adjusted to the constant addition of new personalities to their intimate circle. The children's education included regular exposure to the business of government, as Albert believed that understanding constitutional monarchy required practical experience as well as theoretical knowledge. The older children were allowed to observe some meetings and ceremonies, learning through direct observation how their parents balanced personal feelings with public responsibilities. These lessons proved invaluable preparation for their future roles as supporting members of the royal family and, in some cases, as rulers in their own right. Family life at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, which Victoria and Albert purchased and rebuilt according to their own tastes, provided a more relaxed environment where the children could experience something approaching normal childhood. The Highland setting, with its dramatic landscapes and simpler way of life, offered a counterpoint to the formality of court life. Here, the royal children learned to fish and hunt, to appreciate Scottish culture and traditions, and to understand that their kingdom encompassed many different peoples and ways of life. The Christmas celebrations that Victoria and Albert created for their family helped popularize many traditions that would become standard throughout Britain and beyond. The Christmas tree, a German custom that Albert brought to England, became a symbol of family unity and joy that spread far beyond royal circles. The emphasis on gift-giving that expressed love and thoughtfulness rather than mere obligation reflected the family's commitment to making their wealth and privilege serve human values rather than empty display. The children's marriages became matters of European diplomacy as well as personal happiness. Princess Vicky's marriage to Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia in 1858 was intended to strengthen liberal influences in German politics, while also ensuring her personal happiness with a man who shared her intellectual interests and progressive values. Each subsequent marriage required careful consideration of political implications alongside parental concerns for their children's welfare and contentment. The challenge of maintaining family closeness despite the geographical dispersal that came with royal marriages led Victoria and Albert to develop an extensive correspondence system that kept all family members connected to the central household. The Queen's letters to her married daughters provided advice on everything from child rearing to political developments, while also maintaining the emotional bonds that distance might otherwise have weakened. The boys' military and naval training reflected Albert's belief that royal princes should be prepared for active service rather than merely ceremonial roles. Prince Alfred's naval career and Prince Arthur's military service demonstrated that royal blood carried obligations as well as privileges. Their parents took pride in their sons' professional achievements while also worrying about the dangers that came with actual military service rather than honorary positions. Princess Louise's artistic talents and Princess Helena's charitable work showed how royal daughters could contribute to society in ways that went beyond traditional roles as wives and mothers. Victoria and Albert encouraged their daughters' individual interests and abilities, understanding that the changing world would require royal women to be more than mere ornaments to their husbands' careers. Prince Leopold's hemophilia brought both sorrow and deeper understanding to the royal family's experience of human vulnerability. The care and protection that his condition required taught all family members about the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing each day's blessings. Victoria's fierce protectiveness toward Leopold revealed the depth of maternal love that sometimes competed with her sense of royal duty. The youngest child, Princess Beatrice, born when Victoria was 38, became especially precious to her parents as their baby, who would remain close to home long after her sibling had married and established their own households. The special relationship between Victoria and Beatrice would prove crucial in the Queen's later years, when the companionship of this youngest daughter provided comfort and continuity during times of change and loss. As the 1850s progressed, and the royal children grew from infants to young adults, Victoria and Albert could take pride in their success in creating a family that combined royal dignity with genuine human affection. Their children's obvious love for their parents and for each other provided a model of family life that influenced British society's understanding of the relationship between public duty and private happiness. The royal family's summer holidays at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight became opportunities for the children to experience seaside pleasures that were becoming popular throughout British society. Here, away from the formal constraints of court life, Victoria and Albert could enjoy their children's company in a more relaxed atmosphere, while also demonstrating to the nation that royal happiness came from the same sources as ordinary family joy. The family theatricals and musical performances that became regular features of royal entertainment allowed the children to develop their talents while also learning the confidence that would serve them well in their future public roles. These intimate performances, attended only by family and close friends, revealed sides of royal personality that the public rarely glimpsed, but that humanized the monarchy in ways that strengthened rather than diminished its authority. As evening fell over the royal households where 9 children prepared for sleep under their parents' loving care, Victoria and Albert could reflect on their success in creating something unprecedented in royal history, a large, happy family whose members genuinely loved and supported each other. The empire over which they ruled drew strength from this example of domestic harmony, while the children who carried royal blood into the future had been prepared by their upbringing to serve others with the same dedication their parents had shown in serving them. The mother of an empire had also become the mother of a family whose influence would spread across continents and generations, carrying forward values of duty and love that would outlast any political institution. The afternoon of December 14, 1861, hung over Windsor Castle like a shroud, heavy with unshed snow and unspoken fears, as Queen Victoria knelt beside the bed where Prince Albert lay dying of typhoid fever. At 42, the Queen, who had shared 21 years of perfect partnership with her beloved husband, now faced the unthinkable prospect of continuing alone, carrying the weight of crown and empire without the companion who had made both burden and blessing bearable through wisdom, love, and unwavering support. The final hours of Albert's life unfolded with agonizing slowness, each labored breath marking the approach of a catastrophe that would transform not only Victoria's personal world, but the very nature of the British monarchy. The man who had been her closest advisor, dearest friend, and most passionate love was slipping away despite the efforts of the finest physicians in the empire. No medical skill could arrest the disease that was claiming the life of the prince, who had given the throne new meaning and purpose. Albert's last words, whispered in German, "Ich habe mein Leben für dich und unser Land gelebt. I have lived my life for you and our country," captured the essence of a partnership that had elevated personal love into public service. As Victoria held his hand and felt life ebb away from the fingers that had once caressed her face and signed state documents with equal tenderness and authority, she understood that part of her own soul was departing with him into whatever undiscovered country awaited beyond the veil of earthly existence. The immediate aftermath of Albert's death revealed the depth of Victoria's dependence on his presence and guidance. The Queen, who had ruled with confidence and authority for 24 years, suddenly found herself questioning every decision, doubting every judgment, paralyzed by grief so profound that it seemed to drain color from the world itself. The crimson and gold of royal pageantry gave way to the deep black of mourning that would define the visual landscape of her reign for decades to come. The decision to withdraw from public life came not from constitutional necessity, but from emotional impossibility. Victoria could not imagine appearing in state ceremonies where Albert's absence would be a constant reminder of her loss, could not bear to receive addresses and congratulations when her heart remained fixed on the grave at Frogmore, where her husband's body lay awaiting the mausoleum she was already planning as his eternal resting place. The children, ranging from Princess Vicky, now married and living in Prussia, to 4-year-old Princess Beatrice, became both comfort and responsibility in their mother's darkest hours. Victoria poured her love and anguish into caring for them, seeing in their faces echoes of the man who had helped create them. Yet even this maternal devotion was shadowed by the fear that she might somehow fail them without Albert's guidance, that the children who had been the joy of their partnership might suffer from her inability to be both mother and father to them. The transformation of Windsor Castle into a shrine to Albert's memory began almost immediately after his death. His rooms were preserved exactly as he had left them, with fresh clothes laid out daily and hot water brought for washing hands that would never again touch these familiar objects. The Blue Room where he died became a place of pilgrimage for Victoria, who visited it daily to commune with memories and seek the guidance that his physical presence could no longer provide. The establishment of the Albert Memorial and the Royal Albert Hall represented Victoria's determination to ensure that her husband's contributions to British culture and society would be remembered long after his death. These monuments, funded by public subscription and royal patronage, reflected the genuine affection that the British people had developed for the German prince, who had devoted his life to their welfare and progress. Victoria's correspondence during The early years of widowhood revealed a woman struggling to maintain her sanity and purpose in the face of overwhelming loss. Her letters to her eldest daughter, now Crown Princess of Prussia, became lifelines that connected her to the world of the living, while allowing her to express the depth of her grief to someone who had known and loved Albert as she had. These exchanges between mother and daughter provided emotional release, while also maintaining family bonds across the distance of geography and circumstance. The practical business of government continued despite the Queen's emotional withdrawal, but her absence from public ceremonies and social functions created a vacuum that her ministers struggled to fill. The constitutional monarchy that Albert had helped refine required a visible sovereign to maintain its connection with the people, and Victoria's prolonged mourning began to generate criticism from those who felt she was neglecting her duty to the nation that depended on her leadership. The invention of new mourning rituals and customs during Victoria's widowhood influenced British society's approach to death and remembrance for generations to come. The elaborate etiquette of mourning dress, the extended periods of social withdrawal expected after significant loss, the emphasis on maintaining connections with the deceased through preserved objects and regular commemoration, all reflected the Queen's own struggle to balance acceptance of death with loyalty to cherished memory. Her relationship with her children evolved during these years of grief, as Victoria sought in them both comfort for her loss and continuation of Albert's influence. Prince Bertie, the heir to the throne, bore the particular burden of his mother's conviction that his youthful indiscretions had contributed to his father's fatal illness. The complex dynamics of guilt, love, and expectation that shaped their relationship would influence the monarchy's development long after both had passed from the scene. The Scottish Highlands, particularly Balmoral Castle, became Victoria's preferred refuge during the years of deepest mourning. The landscape that she and Albert had loved together offered solitude without complete isolation, natural beauty that could lift her spirits without betraying her commitment to grief, and memories of happier times that could comfort without overwhelming her fragile emotional equilibrium. Here, attended by faithful Scottish servants who understood her need for simplicity and privacy, Victoria began the slow process of learning to live with loss. John Brown, the Highland servant whose devotion to the royal family had begun during Albert's lifetime, became an increasingly important figure in Victoria's daily life. His straightforward manner and practical wisdom provided emotional support without the complications of court protocol, while his memories of Albert and his understanding of the Scottish traditions the couple had embraced together created a bridge between past happiness and present sorrow. The gradual return to public duty came not from renewed enthusiasm for royal ceremony, but from growing recognition that her withdrawal was causing real harm to the institution she had inherited and the people she was meant to serve. The Republican movements that began to gain strength during her prolonged absence reminded Victoria that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining its connection with the evolving needs and expectations of British society. Her first major public appearance after Albert's death at the opening of Parliament in 1866 required enormous courage and generated tremendous public sympathy. The sight of their queen, still young at 47 but aged by grief and dressed in deep mourning, reminded the British people of the human cost of royal service and rekindled their affection for the sovereign who had shared their joys during her happy marriage and now shared their understanding of loss and endurance. The completion of the Albert Memorial in 1872 marked a turning point in Victoria's mourning process, providing a focus for her devotion that was public rather than private, hopeful rather than despairing. The golden figure of Albert, seated beneath an ornate canopy and surrounded by symbols of the arts and sciences he had championed, became a beacon that drew visitors from around the world while also giving Victoria a place where she could honor her husband's memory through active remembrance rather than passive grief. The decision to publish extracts from her Highland journals and later to write more extensively about her life with Albert represented Victoria's growing understanding that her personal experience of love and loss could serve a larger purpose. These publications, which revealed intimate details of royal family life, unprecedented in their honesty and emotion, created new forms of connection between monarch and subjects based on shared human experience rather than merely constitutional obligation. As the 1870s progressed and Victoria entered her 50s, the acute phase of her mourning gradually gave way to a more settled melancholy that allowed for renewed engagement with life while maintaining loyalty to Albert's memory. The Queen, who had once threatened to abdicate rather than continue without her husband, discovered inner resources of strength and purpose that enabled her to carry on their shared work with dignity and determination. The establishment of new charitable institutions and cultural projects during these years reflected Victoria's growing understanding that the best memorial to Albert's life lay not in monuments of stone and metal, but in continuing the work of social improvement and cultural advancement. That had been his passion. The royal patronage that supported hospitals, schools, and artistic endeavours became a living tribute to the prince whose vision of service had shaped their partnership and would continue to guide her solitary reign. The recognition that she had survived the worst that life could offer and emerged with her commitment to duty intact brought Victoria a different kind of confidence than she had known during her years of happiness. The widow who had thought her useful life had ended with Albert's death discovered that profound loss could deepen rather than diminish one's capacity for service, creating wells of compassion and understanding that enhanced rather than compromised her ability to lead. As you settle into peaceful rest tonight, perhaps you can find comfort in knowing that even the deepest grief can give way to renewed purpose, that love lost to death can be transformed into love expressed through service to others. Victoria's journey through the valley of the shadow of death led her not to despair, but to a deeper understanding of the human condition that would guide her through the remaining decades of her extraordinary reign. The morning light of the 1870s cast long golden shadows across the vast map room at Windsor Castle, where Queen Victoria, now in her 50s and gradually emerging from the depths of widowhood, traced with her finger the red-coloured territories that marked the extent of her dominions. From the frozen territories of Canada to the sun-baked plains of Australia, from the emerald hills of Ireland to the jewelled cities of India, the British Empire had grown to encompass nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and more than a quarter of its population. The transformation of Victoria from the widow of Windsor to the Empress of India in 1876 marked more than a change in title. It represented the empire's recognition of its own unprecedented scope and power. The Royal Titles Act, which granted Victoria this new dignity, acknowledged what had become undeniable truth. Britain ruled the largest empire in human history, one on which the sun literally never set as it circled the globe from colony to colony, protectorate to protectorate, across time zones and continents. The ceremony at which Victoria was proclaimed Empress took place not in London but in Delhi, where the Viceroy of India read the proclamation to assembled princes and dignitaries beneath a scorching January sun. The absence of the Empress herself from this momentous occasion reflected both the practical impossibility of royal travel to such distant lands and the symbolic nature of imperial rule, power exercised from afar through representatives who carried royal authority into the remotest corners of the earth. The daily routine at Windsor and Buckingham Palace now included regular communications from colonial governors, military commanders, and civil administrators scattered across the globe. The red dispatch boxes that arrived at all hours contained reports from governors-general in Canada and Australia, updates on railway construction in Africa, accounts of tribal unrest on the northwest frontier of India, and requests for royal approval of policies that would affect millions of people whom Victoria would never see, but whose welfare had become her responsibility. The India that formed the jewel in Victoria's imperial crown existed for her primarily through the reports of viceroys, the accounts of travellers, and the magnificent gifts that arrived regularly from grateful princes and satisfied administrators. The throne room at Windsor displayed ivory carvings from Bengal, silk tapestries from Kashmir, jewelled weapons from Rajasthan, and precious stones from the mines of Golconda, all testament to the wealth and artistry of the subcontinent that had become the foundation of British prosperity. Yet Victoria's relationship with her Indian subjects remained largely abstract, mediated through officials who interpreted local customs and political developments according to their own understanding and prejudices. The Queen, who insisted on detailed knowledge of British politics and European diplomacy, accepted second-hand accounts of Indian affairs with a trust that perhaps reflected the impossibility of truly understanding such a vast and complex civilization. From the distance of European drawing rooms, the expansion of the Royal Navy during these decades created the maritime foundation upon which imperial power rested. British warships patrolled every ocean, protecting trade routes, suppressing piracy, and demonstrating to potential rivals that Britannia's rule of the waves was more than poetic metaphor. The naval reviews that Victoria occasionally attended at Portsmouth or the Isle of Wight displayed a fleet larger and more powerful than any previous empire had possessed. The development of telegraph communications revolutionized imperial administration, allowing messages to travel from London to India in hours rather than months. Victoria herself became an enthusiastic user of this new technology, exchanging telegrams with governors and commanders across the empire with a frequency that would have been impossible in earlier eras. The invisible threads of copper wire that connected her to her dominions made possible a degree of central control that earlier empires could never have achieved. The colonial exhibitions that became popular during this period brought the empire home to British audiences who had never travelled beyond their own shores. Victoria's visits to these displays of imperial achievement allowed her to see products, artifacts, and representatives from her dominions without the hardships of actual travel. The recreated native villages, the displays of colonial produce, and the demonstrations of local crafts provided a sanitized version of imperial reality that emphasized progress and prosperity while minimizing conflict and exploitation. The network of royal relatives that Victoria had created through her children's marriages now extended across European courts, creating diplomatic connections that enhanced British influence beyond the formal boundaries of the empire. The Crown Princess of Prussia, the Grand Duchess of Hesse, and other royal daughters served as unofficial ambassadors whose personal relationships could smooth negotiations and prevent conflicts that might otherwise have disrupted the peace upon which imperial prosperity depended. The technological marvels of the Victorian age, steamships, railways, the Suez Canal, made possible the rapid movement of people, goods, and information across vast distances that previous generations would have found impassable. Victoria's empire became the first truly global system, connected by steam and steel into a network of trade and communication that brought unprecedented prosperity to the imperial center while transforming societies across the world. The moral justification for imperial rule rested on the assumption that British civilization represented progress and enlightenment that could benefit all peoples willing to accept its guidance. Victoria herself believed deeply in the civilizing mission of empire, seeing British rule as a form of trusteeship that would gradually prepare subject peoples for eventual self-government within a reformed imperial framework that emphasized cooperation rather than domination. The reality of imperial administration often fell short of these high ideals, as reports of conflicts, famines, and administrative failures occasionally pierced the comfortable assumptions of imperial benevolence. The Indian Mutiny of 1857, though it occurred early in Victoria's reign, had demonstrated the fragility of imperial control and the potential for resistance that always lurked beneath the surface of colonial obedience. The economic foundations of the empire rested on the systematic extraction of raw materials from the colonies and their transformation into manufactured goods in British factories for sale throughout the imperial market. This system created unprecedented wealth for British investors and consumers, while ensuring that colonial economies remained dependent on imperial guidance and protection. The cultural impact of empire flowed in both directions, as British institutions and values spread to colonial societies, while exotic foods, textiles, and artistic styles influenced life in the imperial homeland. Victoria's own tastes reflected this cultural exchange as Indian curries appeared on royal menus, Oriental carpets adorned palace floors, and colonial botanical specimens enriched the royal garden. The humanitarian movements that gained strength during Victoria's reign, the abolition of slavery, the suppression of the slave trade, campaigns against cruel local customs, provided moral legitimacy for imperial intervention while also creating standards by which imperial administration could be judged. Victoria's personal support for these causes reflected her sincere belief that imperial power should be used to protect the weak and promote human dignity. The scientific expeditions sponsored by the Royal Geographical Society and other learned institutions extended imperial knowledge while also extending imperial influence. The mapping of previously unknown territories, the cataloguing of flora and fauna, the study of local languages and customs all contributed to the accumulation of knowledge that made effective imperial administration possible while also advancing human understanding of the natural world. The military campaigns that occasionally disturbed imperial peace were presented to Victoria and the British public as necessary police actions to maintain order and protect legitimate interests. The language of imperial warfare emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice while minimizing the human costs of conquest and the moral complexities of imposing foreign rule on unwilling populations. The religious dimension of empire, particularly the missionary activities supported by British churches, provided another form of justification for imperial expansion. Victoria's own deep religious faith made her naturally sympathetic to efforts to spread Christianity throughout her dominions, though she also insisted on religious tolerance that allowed her non-Christian subjects to maintain their traditional beliefs and practices. The coming of age of the first generation of colonial-born subjects created new questions about imperial identity and loyalty. The Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders who had been born under the British flag but had never seen Britain began to develop their own sense of national identity that complemented rather than competed with their imperial allegiance. As the 1880s dawned and Victoria entered the fourth decade of her reign, the empire she governed had achieved a stability and prosperity that seemed to justify the sacrifices required to build and maintain it. The golden afternoon of imperial confidence bathed her dominions in the warm light of achievement, progress, and hope for a future where British values and British institutions would continue to spread the blessings of civilization to an ever-widening circle of grateful subjects. The sun that never set on her empire seemed destined to shine forever on the greatest achievement in human organization that the world had ever known. The Christmas morning of 1887 found Queen Victoria surrounded by more grandchildren than any sovereign in European history, their bright voices echoing through the corridors of Windsor Castle as they celebrated the holiday that had become synonymous with royal family gatherings. At 68, the Queen, who had begun her reign as an isolated young woman, now presided over a vast network of royal relatives whose marriages had woven British influence into the very fabric of European politics and society. The drawing room, where the family gathered for the exchange of presents, resembled a diplomatic congress as much as a domestic celebration. Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, destined to become Kaiser of Germany, played with his English cousins while speaking the mixture of languages that characterized royal family conversation. The children of the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh brought stories from their travels across the Russian Empire, while the offspring of Princess Helena carried news from the German courts, where their parents represented British interests. Victoria's role as the matriarch of European royalty had evolved gradually through the strategic marriages of her 9 children, each union carefully considered for its potential to strengthen British interests, while also ensuring the personal happiness of the bride or groom. The Queen, who had married for love, insisted that her children should also find affection in their arranged matches, creating partnerships that served both diplomatic and domestic purposes with remarkable success. Princess Vicky's marriage to crown. Prince Frederick of Prussia represented the most ambitious attempt to influence European politics through royal alliance. Victoria had hoped that her eldest daughter's liberal principles and British education would moderate Prussian militarism and encourage democratic development in the emerging German Empire. The letters that flowed between mother and daughter carried not just family news, but detailed political analysis and strategic advice that made the Crown Princess an unofficial British ambassador to the most powerful court in Central Europe. The tragedy of Prince Leopold's haemophilia created an unexpected link between the British royal family and the ruling houses of Europe, as the genetic condition passed through Victoria's daughters to their children created bonds of shared concern and mutual support. The Queen, who had once worried about her youngest son's survival, now watched as her grandsons in Spain and Russia faced the same challenges, creating networks of family solidarity that transcended national boundaries. Prince Alfred's naval career and subsequent marriage to Grand Duchess Marie of Russia demonstrated how professional service could enhance diplomatic relationships. His knowledge of naval affairs and his personal connections in St. Petersburg provided valuable insights into Russian policy and intentions, while his wife's position in the Romanov family created channels of communication that formal diplomacy could not match. The Duke of Connaught's military service in India and Canada gave Victoria first-hand reports on imperial affairs from a son whose judgment she trusted implicitly. His letters from the northwest frontier and the Canadian prairies provided perspectives on colonial administration that supplemented official reports with family insights and personal observations. Princess Helena's charitable work and intellectual interests created a different kind of royal influence, as her leadership in women's education and healthcare reform established patterns that spread throughout European society. The Queen, who had once doubted women's capacity for public affairs, now took pride in her daughter's achievements while worrying about the radical implications of female advancement. Princess Louise's artistic talents and unconventional marriage to a commoner reflected changing attitudes toward royal roles and responsibilities. Her work as a sculptor and her support for artistic education demonstrated that royal birth could be used to promote cultural development rather than merely political advantage. The political implications of royal intermarriage became increasingly complex as European nationalism grew stronger and traditional dynastic loyalties competed with emerging national identities. Victoria's grandchildren found themselves torn between family loyalty and patriotic duty as their adopted countries developed interests that might conflict with British policy. The question of succession in various European monarchies became a matter of British concern as Victoria's descendants moved closer to thrones that would give them significant influence over continental affairs. The Queen, who had once worried about the stability of her own succession, now contemplated the possibility that her grandchildren might rule most of Europe. The informal diplomatic network that resulted from royal family connections proved particularly valuable during international crises when formal diplomatic channels might be inadequate or inappropriate. The personal letters that could be exchanged between royal cousins sometimes provided the flexibility needed to resolve conflicts that might otherwise escalate into military confrontation. The changing nature of monarchy itself was reflected in the careers and attitudes of Victoria's children and grandchildren, who faced questions about royal authority and democratic accountability that their grandmother's generation had never encountered. The constitutional monarchies that were emerging across Europe required different skills and approaches than the more traditional autocratic systems that still existed in some countries. As the 1890s approached and Victoria entered the final decade of her reign, the royal family network she had created through her children's marriages represented perhaps her greatest diplomatic achievement. The grandmother, who had once been an isolated widow, had become the connecting link between European courts, whose cooperation or conflict would determine the continent's future peace and prosperity. The blood royal that flowed through her descendants carried with it the hope that family affection might prove stronger than national rivalry, that the bonds of kinship might weave a web of peace strong enough to prevent the catastrophic wars that seemed to threaten European civilization with increasing frequency. The morning light of January 1895 streamed through the frost-etched windows of Windsor Castle as Queen Victoria, now 75 years old and in the 58th year of her reign, prepared for another day of duties that seemed to grow more complex even as her physical strength gradually diminished. The world that awakened outside her palace windows bore little resemblance to the one she had inherited as a young woman. Steam had given way to electricity, horse-drawn carriages competed with motor cars, and the certainties of early Victorian society were yielding to questions and challenges that tested the foundations of everything her generation had built. The technological marvels that now surrounded royal life would have seemed like magic to the young queen who had once written letters by candlelight and travelled by horse-drawn coach. Electric lights illuminated the palace corridors with a steadiness that no oil lamp could match, while the telephone that had been installed in her private apartments allowed instantaneous communication with ministers and family members across the kingdom. The gramophone that occasionally entertained her evening hours preserved the voices of singers and musicians with a fidelity that brought distant performance into her personal drawing room. The British Empire that Victoria governed in her declining years had reached its greatest extent, encompassing territories and populations that strained the imagination of previous generations. The map that dominated her private study showed red-colored dominions that stretched from the Arctic territories of Canada to the temperate forests of New Zealand, from the tropical jungles of Burma to the desert expanses of Australia. Yet this vast empire, which seemed the ultimate expression of human organizational achievement, faced challenges that threatened its stability and unity. The rise of Germany as a unified and increasingly militaristic power cast shadows over European politics that even family connections could not entirely dispel. Victoria's grandson, Wilhelm II, now Kaiser of the German Empire, represented a new generation of rulers whose nationalist ambitions seemed to override the dynastic loyalties that had once maintained continental peace. The grandmother, who had hoped to influence European affairs through royal marriages, now watched with growing concern as her own descendants prepared for conflicts that might pit cousin against cousin in struggles for national supremacy. The social transformations occurring within Britain itself challenged assumptions about class, gender, and political authority that had seemed immutable during Victoria's youth. The expansion of democratic participation through successive reform acts had transferred real power to elected representatives who owed their positions to popular support rather than royal favor. The Queen, who had once been able to influence policy through personal relationships with her ministers, now found herself increasingly relegated to ceremonial functions that honored tradition while acknowledging the reality of democratic governance. The emergence of labor movements and socialist political parties represented challenges to the social order that Victoria had spent her lifetime defending and refining. The strikes and demonstrations that periodically disrupted industrial production reflected tensions between capital and labor that seemed to threaten the stability upon which imperial prosperity depended. The Queen, who had always believed in the harmonious cooperation of different social classes, now witnessed conflicts that suggested fundamental contradictions in the system she had inherited and helped to develop. The women's suffrage movement that gained momentum during these years presented Victoria with particularly complex challenges to her worldview. As a female monarch who had exercised supreme political authority for more than half a century, she embodied the possibility of women's leadership while simultaneously opposing the extension of political rights to her female subjects. The paradox of a queen who ruled an empire while denying her countrywomen. The vote reflected tensions between traditional authority and democratic principles that would outlast her reign. The scientific discoveries and medical advances of the late Victorian period brought both wonder and uncertainty to a woman whose religious faith had been shaped by earlier, simpler understandings of divine creation and human purpose. The evolutionary theories that challenged biblical accounts of creation, the psychological studies that questioned traditional notions of consciousness and identity, the archaeological findings that revealed civilizations far older than previously imagined, all contributed to an intellectual ferment that made the certainties of Victoria's youth seem increasingly fragile. The cultural changes that transformed British society during the 1890s reflected broader shifts in values and expectations that sometimes troubled the aging Queen. The literature and art that younger generations embraced often challenged the moral certainties that had guided her lifetime, while the entertainment and leisure activities that became popular seemed to emphasize pleasure over duty, individual expression over social obligation. The imperial challenges that arose during this period tested both Victoria's understanding of her role and the empire's capacity for adaptation. The growing demands for self-government from Canada, Australia, and other settler colonies required delicate negotiations that balanced imperial unity with colonial autonomy. The Queen, who had once exercised direct authority over colonial policies, now found herself approving arrangements that transferred real power to elected governments whose loyalty to the crown was voluntary rather than enforced. The technological revolution in communications that connected the empire through telegraph cables and improved postal services also created new opportunities for criticism and dissent. The newspapers and magazines that now circulated throughout the dominions carried diverse perspectives on imperial policies that sometimes challenged official narratives and government explanations. Victoria's empire became more connected, but also more contentious as improved communications enabled previously isolated subjects to coordinate their opposition to unpopular policies. The military conflicts that periodically disrupted imperial peace during the 1890s required increasingly sophisticated justifications as public opinion became more influential in policymaking. The campaigns in the Sudan, the tensions with Russia over Afghanistan, the growing competition with other European powers for influence in Africa, all demanded explanations that satisfied democratic constituencies while maintaining imperial prestige and protecting strategic interests. Victoria's personal relationships during these years reflected both the isolation that came with extreme old age and the comfort that derived from established routines and trusted companionship. The death of John Brown in 1883 had removed one of her closest confidants, while the marriages of her children left her increasingly dependent on servants and secretaries whose devotion could never fully replace family intimacy. The continuing correspondence with her children and grandchildren provided emotional sustenance while also keeping her informed about European developments that might affect British interests. The letters that arrived daily from courts across the continent carried news of family celebrations and sorrows alongside intelligence about political movements and diplomatic negotiations that formal channels might not reveal. The religious faith that had sustained Victoria through personal tragedies and public challenges remained strong, though it was now tested by intellectual developments and social changes that challenged traditional Christian teachings. The Queen, who had once found comfort in simple biblical truths, now grappled with questions about divine providence and human progress that reflected the theological uncertainties of her age. The routine of royal duties that filled her days had become both burden and blessing, tedious in their repetitive nature but also reassuring in their continuity with past practice. The audiences with ministers, the signing of official documents, the ceremonial appearances that maintained the monarchy's public presence all required energy that she had to marshal carefully while also providing structure that gave meaning to days that might otherwise have felt empty or purposeless. The artistic patronage that had always been part of royal responsibility took on new importance as Victoria sought to leave cultural legacies that would outlast her political influence. The museums, galleries, and educational institutions that benefited from royal support represented investments in human development that transcended the immediate concerns of governmental administration. As the century that had become synonymous with her name drew toward its close, Victoria could survey achievements that seemed to justify the confidence her subjects had placed in her leadership. The empire she governed was larger and more prosperous than any in human history. The nation she ruled had become the workshop of the world, and the constitutional monarchy she had inherited had evolved into a system that balanced democratic accountability with institutional stability. Yet the challenges that awaited her successors seemed as daunting as any her generation had faced, requiring new forms of leadership for problems that defied traditional solutions. The evening hours at Windsor, when official duties were complete and the palace settled into its nocturnal quiet, provided opportunities for reflection on a lifetime of service that had transformed both the monarchy and the nation it served. The old Queen, who prepared for sleep in rooms that had witnessed the full drama of the Victorian age, could rest in the knowledge that she had fulfilled the promise made so many years ago by a young woman who had vowed simply to be good. The morning of June 22nd, 1897 dawned bright and clear over London, as if the very heavens had conspired to honour the remarkable milestone that the nation was preparing to celebrate. Queen Victoria, now 78 years old and in the 60th year of her reign, awoke to find her capital city transformed into a living tapestry of red, white, and blue, with decorations stretching from the humblest cottage to the grandest mansion in tribute to a sovereign whose reign had witnessed the greatest transformation in human history. The Diamond Jubilee, unprecedented in British history and unmatched by any other monarchy, represented more than a personal anniversary. It marked the culmination of an era that had seen the British Empire reach its zenith, the Industrial Revolution transform human civilization, and constitutional monarchy evolve into a system that balanced democratic progress with institutional stability. Victoria's 60 years on the throne encompassed achievements that would have been unimaginable to the young woman who had awakened to find herself queen on that distant June morning in 1837. The procession route from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral had been carefully planned to showcase not just royal pageantry, but imperial grandeur on a scale never before attempted. Representatives from every corner of the empire had gathered in London to pay homage to their sovereign, Indian princes in silk and jewels, Canadian Mounties in scarlet uniforms, Australian light horsemen, African colonial troops and delegations, from territories whose very names spoke of the global reach of British influence. Victoria herself, though physically frail and unable to manage the stairs of St. Paul's Cathedral, presided over the celebration with a dignity that reflected both her personal resilience and her understanding of the symbolic importance of the occasion. The open carriage that carried her through streets lined with cheering crowds revealed a small, black-clad figure whose presence seemed almost miraculous to subjects who had grown up knowing no other sovereign. The crowds that gathered to witness. The Jubilee procession represented every level of British society, from aristocrats who had reserved places on decorated balconies to working-class families who had walked miles to catch a glimpse of their queen. The enthusiasm that greeted Victoria's appearance reflected genuine affection for a monarch who had shared their joys and sorrows through 6 decades of unprecedented change and challenge. The imperial troops who formed the most spectacular element of the procession told the story of an empire that had grown from a collection of trading posts and strategic bases into a global civilization encompassing nearly a quarter of the Earth's population. The sight of soldiers from India marching beside cavalry from Canada, while African contingents followed Australian mounted rifles, demonstrated the diversity and unity that characterized British imperial achievement at its height. The ceremonial aspects of the Diamond Jubilee reflected careful attention to both traditional protocol and practical necessity. The decision to hold the Thanksgiving service outside St. Paul's Cathedral, rather than requiring the aging Queen to climb the cathedral steps, showed how royal ceremony could adapt to human limitations while maintaining its essential dignity and religious significance. The technological innovations that enabled worldwide coverage of the Jubilee celebrations represented themselves a testament to Victorian achievement. The telegraph cables that carried news of the festivities to every corner of the empire, the photographs that preserved the day's highlights for posterity, the improved printing technology that made possible the mass production of commemorative materials, all demonstrated the communications revolution that had transformed human society during Victoria's reign. The literary and artistic tributes that marked the Diamond Jubilee revealed the cultural renaissance that had flourished under Victoria's patronage. The poets who composed verses in her honor, the musicians who created ceremonial works for the occasion, the artists who captured the day's pageantry in paint and sculpture, all contributed to a celebration that honored not just political achievement, but cultural flowering. The international dimension of the Diamond Jubilee reflected Britain's position as the world's dominant power and Victoria's status as the most respected monarch of her age. The foreign royalty who attended the celebrations, the diplomatic representatives who brought greetings from their governments, the colonial officials who reported on festivities in distant territories, all testified to the global significance of Victoria's reign. The religious services that accompanied the Jubilee festivities emphasized the moral and spiritual foundations that Victoria believed had sustained her reign and blessed her empire. The prayers of thanksgiving offered in churches throughout Britain and the dominions reflected a widespread conviction that divine providence had guided British progress and would continue to bless British endeavours. The charitable activities that were organized in connection with the Jubilee demonstrated Victoria's commitment to using royal occasions to benefit her subjects' welfare. The Jubilee funds that supported hospitals, schools, and relief organizations showed how royal celebration could be transformed into practical assistance for those in need. The retrospective assessments of Victoria's reign that appeared in newspapers and magazines during the Jubilee period attempted to measure achievements that seemed to defy conventional analysis. The statistical comparisons between Britain in 1837 and Britain in 1897 revealed transformations in population, prosperity, education, and health that represented progress on an unprecedented scale. the personal tributes that poured in from ordinary subjects revealed the affection and respect that Victoria had earned through her dedication to duty and her sharing of human joys and sorrows. The letters from colonial settlers who credited her reign with opportunities they could never have imagined, from workers who had benefited from social reforms enacted during her rule, from women who found in her example inspiration for their own achievements, all testified to the human impact of her sovereignty. The future challenges that were acknowledged even during the Jubilee celebrations reflected awareness that the achievements of the Victorian age would require constant vigilance and adaptation to preserve. The international tensions that threatened European peace, the social questions that demanded continued attention, the imperial responsibilities that would test future generations, all shadowed the day's festivities with reminders of work that remained to be done. The family dimension of the Diamond Jubilee brought together representatives of the vast network of royal relatives that Victoria's children's marriages had created across Europe. The presence of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren provided evidence of personal as well as political legacy, ensuring that Victoria's influence would continue through bloodlines that connected most of Europe's ruling houses. The emotional impact of the Diamond Jubilee on Victoria herself was profound, as she experienced a level of public affection and international recognition that exceeded anything she had known during her long reign. The Queen, who had sometimes felt isolated by the burdens of sovereignty, now found herself embraced by the love of subjects who understood the magnitude of her service and sacrifice. The evening celebrations that concluded the Diamond Jubilee featured illuminations and fireworks that transformed London into a wonderland of light and colour. The sight of the capital city glowing with electric and gas illumination provided a fitting symbol for a reign that had brought enlightenment in every sense of the word to the British Empire and the wider world. As Victoria returned to the quiet of Windsor Castle after the day's unprecedented celebrations, she could reflect on a life that had exceeded every expectation and fulfilled every hope that her subjects might have harboured for their young queen 60 years earlier. The Diamond Jubilee had become not just a celebration of longevity but a recognition of transformation, personal, national, and imperial, that marked the high point of British achievement and influence. The messages of congratulation that continued to arrive from around the world in the days following the Jubilee spoke to Victoria's unique position as both a national symbol and an international figure whose influence transcended political boundaries. Kings and presidents, governors and prime ministers, ordinary citizens and distinguished leaders all seemed to understand that they had witnessed something unprecedented in human history, the celebration of a reign that had redefined the possibilities of constitutional monarchy. The photographic records of the Diamond Jubilee, preserved for posterity through the new technologies that Victoria's reign had fostered, captured not just the pageantry of the day, but the genuine emotion of participants and spectators alike. The images of the elderly queen acknowledging the cheers of her subjects would become iconic representations of an era when personal monarchy and democratic progress had achieved a unique synthesis. The charitable donations inspired by the Jubilee celebrations created lasting institutions that would serve British society long after the festivities were forgotten. The hospitals and schools endowed with Jubilee funds, the scholarships established in Victoria's name, the relief organisations supported by public generosity, all represented the transformation of ceremonial celebration into practical benefit for those most in need of assistance. The colonial exhibitions that accompanied the Jubilee brought the empire home to British audiences in ways that fostered both pride and understanding. The displays of imperial products and achievements, the demonstrations of colonial arts and crafts, the presence of imperial representatives in their traditional dress, all contributed to a deeper appreciation of the diversity and richness of Victoria's global dominions. The literary works inspired by the Diamond Jubilee included some of the finest poetry and prose of the Victorian age, as writers attempted to capture in words the significance of an era that seemed to embody humanity's highest aspirations. The verses that celebrated Victoria's reign and the essays that analyzed her achievements became part of the cultural legacy that would influence how future generations understood the 19th century. The technological demonstrations that formed part of the Jubilee celebrations showcased the scientific and industrial progress that had characterized Victoria's reign. The exhibits of new inventions, the displays of manufacturing techniques, the demonstrations of communication technologies, all illustrated the transformation of human capability that had occurred during the 6 decades of her sovereignty. The international peace that prevailed during the Diamond Jubilee seemed to vindicate Victoria's belief that constitutional monarchy could provide stability in an era of rapid change. The cooperation between nations that the celebrations fostered, the diplomatic courtesies exchanged between traditional rivals, the spirit of goodwill that characterized international relations during the Jubilee period, all suggested that the Victorian synthesis of progress and stability might be sustainable. The religious dimension of the Diamond Jubilee reflected Victoria's deep faith and her conviction that divine providence had guided her reign and blessed her empire. The Thanksgiving services held throughout Britain and the Dominions expressed gratitude for achievements that seemed to transcend purely human effort, while also acknowledging the moral responsibilities that accompanied unprecedented power and influence. The assessment of social progress during Victoria's reign that emerged from Jubilee retrospectives revealed advances in education, health, and living standards that had improved the lives of millions of her subjects. The statistics showing increased literacy, longer life expectancy, and greater prosperity provided concrete evidence of the benefits that had flowed from the political stability and economic growth of the Victorian era. The recognition of women's contributions to Victorian achievements that formed part of the Jubilee celebrations reflected changing attitudes toward female capability and potential. The tributes to female philanthropists, educators, writers, and reformers acknowledged that Victoria's example as a reigning queen had helped expand opportunities for all women throughout her dominions. As the immediate excitement of the Diamond Jubilee gave way to quieter reflection on its significance, Victoria found herself contemplating the legacy she would leave to her successors and the challenges they would face in maintaining the achievements of her reign. The Queen, who had begun her sovereignty as an inexperienced young woman, now possessed the wisdom that came from 60 years of constant learning and adaptation to changing circumstances. The Diamond Jubilee had become a moment of national and imperial unity that transcended the political divisions and social tensions that characterized the 1890s. The celebration of Victoria's reign provided an opportunity for all her subjects to participate in a shared recognition of achievements that belonged to the entire nation rather than to any particular class or party. The global significance of the Diamond Jubilee extended far beyond the British Empire, as other nations recognized in Victoria's reign a model of how traditional institutions could adapt to modern conditions without losing their essential character. The constitutional monarchy that had evolved during her sovereignty offered lessons for other societies seeking to balance democratic progress with institutional continuity. As Victoria prepared for sleep on the night of her Diamond Jubilee, surrounded by the gifts and messages that had poured in from every corner of her empire and beyond, she could rest in the knowledge that her long life of service had been recognized and appreciated by those she had devoted herself to serving. The celebration that had honored her reign had also honored the values and achievements that defined the Victorian age. Progress tempered by stability, innovation guided by wisdom, power exercised with responsibility, and success measured not just by material advancement but by moral and spiritual growth. The Diamond Jubilee had marked not just the completion of 60 years on the throne, but the culmination of a life devoted to duty, service, and the welfare of others. The small, elderly woman who had been cheered by millions throughout that glorious June day embodied the highest aspirations of constitutional monarchy and democratic progress, proving that traditional institutions could evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential dignity and purpose. The winter morning of January 22nd, 1901, dawned grey and sombre over the Isle of Wight, where Osborne House stood silently overlooking the Solent, its windows reflecting the pale light of a new century that would no longer know the presence of the woman who had given her name to an entire age. Queen Victoria, at 81 years old and in the 64th year of her reign, lay peacefully in her favourite retreat, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had gathered from across Europe to witness the end of an era that had shaped the modern world. The room where Victoria spent her final days retained the simplicity and comfort that she had always preferred over elaborate state apartments. The bed where she rested was modest, covered with plain white linen and warmed by fires that burned steadily in the grate. The windows looked out over gardens that Albert had designed decades earlier, their bare winter branches holding promise of spring renewal that Victoria would not live to see, but which symbolized the continuity of life beyond any individual existence. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's eldest grandson, had travelled from Berlin to be present at his grandmother's bedside, setting aside the political tensions that had grown between Britain and Germany to honour family bonds that transcended national boundaries. The sight of the future German emperor kneeling beside the bed of the British Queen embodied the complex web of royal relationships that Victoria had woven across Europe through her children's marriages. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter and constant companion in her final years, maintained her vigil with the devotion that had characterized their relationship since Albert's death 40 years earlier. The daughter, who had sacrificed her own independence to care for her widowed mother, now provided the final comfort that eased Victoria's passage from earthly sovereignty to whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of mortality. The Prince of Wales, soon to become Edward VII, waited nearby for the moment when the crown would pass to him, bringing with it responsibilities that seemed almost overwhelming after his mother's unprecedented reign. The man who had lived his entire adult life in Victoria's shadow now prepared to step into the blazing light of kingship, carrying forward traditions she had established while also adapting to challenges she could never have imagined. The last words that Victoria spoke, whispered so softly that only those closest to her bedside could hear them, were Albert, the name of the husband who had been gone for 4 decades, but who had remained the guiding star of her life and reign. In calling his name as she prepared to join him in death, Victoria demonstrated the constancy of love that had sustained her through triumph and tragedy, duty and despair, the heights of imperial glory and the depths of personal sorrow. As the clock in the hallway struck 6:30 on the evening of January 22nd, 1901, Queen Victoria drew her final breath, surrounded by the love of family and the quiet dignity that had characterized her entire life. The woman who had awakened to find herself queen at 18 had now completed the longest reign in British history, transforming not only the monarchy, but the very nature of sovereignty itself. The silence that followed Victoria's death was profound, not empty, but full of the weight of completed destiny and fulfilled purpose. Those present understood that they had witnessed not just the end of a life, but the close of an age, when individual character and determination could shape the course of history through sheer force of will and dedication to duty. The news of Victoria's death spread swiftly across the telegraph networks that her reign had fostered, reaching every corner of an empire on which the sun never set, but which would never again know the steady guidance of the sovereign who had presided over its greatest expansion and achievement. From the frozen territories of Canada to the tropical colonies of the Pacific, from the ancient civilizations of India to the pioneer settlements of Australia, Victoria's subjects learned that their queen had passed into history. The period of mourning that followed encompassed not just Britain but much of the civilized world, as nations that had sometimes been rivals joined in recognizing the passing of a figure who had transcended mere political authority to become a symbol of stability, progress, and moral purpose. The black-draped buildings and half-masted flags that appeared throughout the empire testified to genuine grief for a sovereign who had earned her people's love through decades of faithful service. The funeral arrangements reflected both Victoria's personal wishes for simplicity and the nation's need to honor appropriately the sovereign who had guided them through their greatest century. The service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, combined the intimate character she had requested with the magnificent ceremonial that befitted the conclusion of such a remarkable reign. The procession that carried Victoria's coffin from Osborne to Windsor provided a final display of the imperial unity and diversity that had characterized her reign. The troops that lined the route included representatives from every corner of the empire, while the mourners who followed the gun carriage carrying her remains included royalty from across Europe and officials from around the world. The burial service in the mausoleum at Frogmore, where Victoria was finally laid to rest, beside the husband she had loved so deeply and mourned so long, provided the quiet conclusion she had desired. The simple ceremony, attended only by family members, emphasized the personal rather than the political aspects of her life, honoring the woman as well as the Queen. The immediate aftermath of Victoria's death revealed the extent to which her personality had shaped not just British governance but the entire imperial system. The advisors who had grown accustomed to her methods, the civil servants who had learned to anticipate her preferences, the colonial administrators who had relied on her guidance, all faced the challenge of adapting to new leadership while preserving the essential continuity of imperial administration. The tributes that poured in from around the world reflected recognition of achievements that extended far beyond the boundaries of the British Empire. Political leaders, literary figures, religious authorities, and ordinary citizens from every continent contributed to a chorus of appreciation for a sovereign whose influence had touched virtually every aspect of 19th century development. The key historical assessments that began immediately after Victoria's death attempted to measure the significance of a reign that had witnessed unprecedented transformation in human society. The constitutional monarchy she had refined, the imperial system she had guided, the social progress she had encouraged, all became subjects for analysis and evaluation by scholars seeking to understand the Victorian achievement. The children and grandchildren who inherited Victoria's legacy faced the challenge of maintaining her standards while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The network of royal relationships she had created across Europe would be tested by the nationalist tensions and military conflicts that would soon engulf the continent in unprecedented warfare. The British Empire that Victoria bequeathed to her successors was larger and more powerful than any in human history, but it also faced challenges that would require new forms of leadership and administration. The dominions that had grown to maturity during her reign demanded greater autonomy, while subject peoples increasingly questioned the assumptions that had justified imperial rule. The industrial and technological revolution that had accelerated during Victoria's reign continued to transform society in ways that created both opportunities and problems for future generations. The railways, telegraph systems, and manufacturing capabilities that had made British dominance possible also created new forms of competition and new sources of international tension. The social changes that had begun during Victoria's reign, the expansion of democratic participation, the advancement of women's rights, the improvement of working conditions, would continue to reshape British society long after her death. The foundations she had helped establish would prove strong enough to support further progress toward greater equality and justice. The religious and moral influences that had characterized Victoria's approach to sovereignty left lasting impressions on British culture and imperial policy. The combination of Christian duty and practical responsibility that had guided her decisions established precedents that would influence her successors' understanding of royal obligation and public service. The cultural achievements of the Victorian age in literature, art, science, and philosophy represented permanent additions to human knowledge and creative expression. The patronage that Victoria had provided to artists and scholars, combined with the prosperity and stability that her reign had fostered, created conditions that allowed genius to flourish across multiple disciplines. As the new century dawned, without the presence of the woman who had dominated the previous age, Britain and the world faced an uncertain future that would test whether the achievements of the Victorian era could be sustained and extended. The institutions Victoria had strengthened, the values she had embodied, the example she had provided, all would be challenged by forces that were already gathering strength as the 20th century began. The legacy of Queen Victoria extended far beyond the constitutional monarchy she had refined or the empire she had governed. Her greatest achievement lay in demonstrating that traditional institutions could adapt to modern conditions while maintaining their essential character and purpose. The synthesis of stability and progress that characterized her reign provided a model for democratic development that influenced societies far beyond the British Empire. In the quiet of the mausoleum at Frogmore, where Victoria finally rested beside the husband whose love had sustained her through 60 years of widowhood and sovereignty, the woman who had been born an unlikely princess and had died the most powerful monarch in the world could sleep in the peace that comes from duty faithfully discharged and trust honorably fulfilled. The Victorian age had ended, but the principles and achievements that defined it would continue to influence human development for generations to come. As you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can sense something of the peace that Victoria found in her final rest, the satisfaction that comes from a life fully lived in service to others, the contentment that follows from having met every challenge with courage and every opportunity with wisdom. Her long sleep reminds us that even the greatest earthly achievements must eventually give way to the eternal rest that awaits all who have fought the good fight and kept the faith. But her example continues to inspire all who would lead with integrity, serve with dedication, and love with constancy through whatever trials and triumphs their own lives may bring.